She's also a public intellectual. She writes often for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Nation, Los Angeles Times. And she's currently writing 2 books, one that I want to read really fast, and because I was telling her that you had written a script instead of a book. It is about Chinese gold miners in California, Australia, and South Africa. That sounds like an adventure book. And the other one is about the idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants. As I have said several times, there are today like 52 or 53 countries who has a greater proportion of immigrants in their population than the United States. But none of them makes a big deal about them being nations of immigrants. Actually, the ones with the highest proportion of foreigners in their population, like United Arab Emirates and Kuwait and places like that, don't even have a word for immigrants. They don't think of people that were going to become part of the polity eventually. So that's an intriguing thing. Why the strength of this idea and the complications and the contradictions of the realities. And so, Mae, thanks for coming. This is your 3rd time, I think, here. So that's what happens to generous colleagues. They're exploited. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jose. It's a pleasure always to come to Barnard. And thank you all for coming tonight. And as Professor Moya said, this is taken from a book that I'm working on now. So let me start here. At the base of the Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus's famous poem, The New Colossus, is engraved on a bronze plaque. For many people, this poem expresses the idea of America as a nation of immigrants. Its most famous lines, of course, are those spoken by the statue herself. A mighty woman with a torch, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. The wretched refuge of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Lazarus called the statue, the speaker of these lines, not the Statue of Liberty as we know it, but Mother of Exiles. I draw attention to this because it suggests that we might read this welcome of immigrants in a different way than it is conventionally understood. That is to say, we tend to think of immigrants who came into New York Harbor in the late 19th and early 20th century, and more generally throughout American history, as the tired and poor of the world, and who, by dint of their hard work, ambition, prove that anyone can come to the United States and make it. Now, Lazarus's reference to immigrants as exiles who are yearning to be free suggests another view of America that is not just a land of opportunity, but also a land of refuge from persecution and oppression. Lazarus, the daughter of wealthy Jewish family in New York, was moved to write The New Colossus by the anti-Jewish pogroms in Tsarist Russia and her sympathy for the Jewish immigrants who were arriving in New York in large numbers. I start with this poem because it suggests that in the 19th century there was not a sharp distinction between those who immigrated for economic improvement and those whom today we would call political migrants or refugees and asylees. Many migrants in the 19th century were motivated by both economic and political factors. The Germans after the failed 1848 revolution, Irish exiled from famine and British colonial oppression, Chinese displaced during the Taiping Rebellion, and Lazarus's Jews fleeing Tsarist pogroms. The distinction between the economic and the political in the world migration since arose only in the 20th century during the Second World War and its aftermath. The emergencies of the wartime gave rise to a new international regime that created the refugee as a new legal subject. For better or for worse, the distinction between economic and political migrants generated new ways of thinking about migration and the value judgments we make, judgments about the qualities of different kinds of immigrants and the obligations that states have or do not have towards them. So this evening, I want to think about the idea as America as a land of refuge for the oppressed and persecuted, a concept that is as much a part of our national identity as the idea that we are a nation of immigrants. Both of these tropes have some historical basis, but in the popular imagination, history is overwhelmed by mythology. These myths are powerful elements in our national identity, or at least a version of our national identity. Let's call it the liberal version of national identity, that now is at war with another identity, let's call it the chauvinistic identity, one that imagines America as being great because it is exclusive, protectionist, and unwelcoming. Now, maybe in this climate, it's overly harsh to scrutinize liberal national ideals. But I contend that if we are to resist nativism and racism, we must have more than slogans and myths. We must have knowledge. So after looking at a short history of refugee and asylum, I will turn to the current moment, the situation at the border today, and offer you some thoughts or questions about political and moral responsibilities that we have towards immigrants and refugees. Now, we're often reminded, of course, that America has always been an asylum for the oppressed and persecuted. This idea gives noble origins to the nation's founding. As President Jimmy Carter famously said in 1977, human rights invented America. Now, to be sure, during the colonial and revolutionary period, many Europeans came to America as religious exiles, Puritans as well as French Protestants and Baptists and others. They did indeed seek refuge from persecution by state and church authorities in England and France. But it's also the case that many of these Protestant minorities were intolerant of those who professed other, different faiths than their own. The Puritans were the most notorious in this regard, banishing Quakers, whom they called pests, and hanging those who dared to return. But in fact, none of the original colonies believed in religious freedom for all. Many had established churches, and only Pennsylvania had an explicit anti-establishment policy. Perhaps the Puritans occupy an outsized place in our founding story because later Americans could read them as embodying the two great strands of American liberty: freedom of religion, that is their flight from religious persecution, and economic liberty, that is the possibilities of prosperity that could be realized by the Calvinist work ethic. William Penn and Roger Williams were actually more true to this combination because they founded colonies based on freedom of conscience on both ideological and economic grounds, arguing that such a policy was necessary to attract settlers and to promote trade. At the time of the nation's founding, the diversity of Protestant sects in the various colonies made it impossible to impose an official religion upon the new nation. Still, the Constitution's First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, protected Americans only from coercion by the national government. All of the original 13 states had some form of state-supported religion, some well into the 19th century. It was not until the late 1940s that the Supreme Court ruled decisively that the wall of separation between church and state must be high and impregnable. But even that has not always been the case, especially with regard to refugee resettlement, and I'll return to this point later. What I want to emphasize here is that we have glossed over many of the complexities and contradictions in the nation's history to construct a noble origin story. Religious liberty was more narrow than our modern understanding of that concept, and it also existed alongside other dynamics of settlement, such as the relentless dispossession of native peoples and the importation and exploitation of enslaved peoples from Africa in both the North and the South. Now, in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter, as I mentioned, sought to anchor a foreign policy based on human rights in the nation's hoary traditions, but he certainly misspoke when he said human rights invented America. The rights that the nation's founders invoked were not human rights as we know them today, but natural rights, that is, life, liberty, and property, which were much more circumscribed and which applied to only educated and propertied white men. Worse, perhaps, was President Ronald Reagan's hijacking of John Winthrop's phrase, "We shall be as a city on a hill," adding the word shining to describe the city, and repurposing it into a boast of America's material abundance as proof of America's exceptionality. Winthrop had met something entirely different. He was warning his fellow Puritans that if they failed to keep their covenant with God, their sins and errors would be exposed for all the world to see. But in another sense, Reagan was continuing a long tradition that linked the economic and the political or religious aspects of immigration. For example, in his first inaugural address, Thomas Jefferson asked, "Shall oppressed humanity find no asylum on this globe?" Now, Jefferson was famously committed to religious freedom, but in this speech, he was primarily interested in immigrants for nation building. He wanted artisans and farmers who could contribute to the nation's development, both economically and by becoming good citizens. He believed that those who came with, quote, bona fide purposes of embarking his life and fortunes permanently with us could learn the character and capabilities of citizenship, unquote. Now, Lincoln also desired immigration for settlement, especially to check slave expansion in the West. The rhetoric of the time suggests the enduring power of the trope of asylum. In Lincoln's words, the Homestead Act, which offered freehold title of land in the West to both citizens and non-citizens, should assist, quote, people borne down by the weight of their shackles, the oppression of tyranny, unquote. Now, here Lincoln was not referring to the Puritans. More likely, he was thinking about the German immigrants who came to America after the 1848 Revolution, many of whom settled in Illinois. Lincoln also advocated for immigration in anticipation of the need to rebuild the nation after the Civil War and urged Congress to pass an act to encourage immigration in 1864. So here we can see how the moral appeal both justified and covered aims and the aims of immigration. Throughout the long era of open borders, it was easy to fuse asylum talk and nation building. And in fact, it did not matter if immigrants came for political or economic reasons or both. In many cases, the distinction was blurry. Immigration was often associated both with political crisis or violence at home and the prospect of immigration, of economic improvement abroad. The distinction between the economic and the political is a product of the 20th century, born of emergency. Both world wars leading to displacement and removals, and the rise of domestic laws of restriction. That is to say, people who were rendered stateless or otherwise displaced from their homelands found no other countries that would take them. The doomed voyage of the MS St. Louis, which left Germany in 1939 with 900 Jewish refugees, was refused entry in Cuba, the US, and Canada, and sent back to Germany. It's perhaps the most famous example. At the end of World War II, there were over 8 million people in so-called displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. Most were not concentration camp survivors, but people who had been forcibly moved by the Nazis to labor under the Reich. 7 million were repatriated in 1945, mostly to Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union, leaving 1.2 million homeless, including Jews and people who refused repatriation. The idea of resettlement became a way to close the camps, meet labor market needs in resettlement countries, and advance Cold War objectives. Okay, who is a refugee? After World War II, the UN passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt famously contributed to its writing, and we think of it as the moment of modern refugee policy. These are some of the main articles that pertain to migration and asylum. Note, however, that while the right to exit is considered a human right, that is the right to leave one's country, no one has the right to enter any particular country. This paradox reflects a larger problem. We conceive of human rights as transcending the prerogatives of nation states, but they cannot be forced upon nation states. In 1951, the Geneva Convention on Refugees established 3 important principles that have guided refugee policy into our own time. First, it recognized that the problem of refugees and asylum is international in scope and nature and cannot therefore be achieved without international cooperation. This is the idea that when states fail, other states have a responsibility to assist those who have been failed. Second, it defined a refugee as a person who suffered from or faced the likelihood of persecution on grounds of religion, race, national origin, ideology, etc. This created a line between the political and the non-political and required that refugee and asylum be determined on an individual basis. Third, the Geneva Convention established the principle of non-refoulement, that is, that refugees and asylum seekers cannot be forcibly returned to their country of origin if they would face persecution once returned. Now, the need for international cooperation and the principle of no return are the two most important positive key features of the Geneva Convention. The convention created pathways for migrants who would otherwise be excluded from other countries by their restrictive immigration laws. In this way, it made a chink in the armor of national sovereignty. But the convention also defined refugees narrowly as those who suffered from individual persecution on specified grounds. This was meant to disallow people who were escaping criminal justice in Western countries, as well as people fleeing from disaster, civil war, or other major disruptions who might not have experienced individual persecution. These distinctions were made to favor people fleeing from communism in the West, including high-profile dissidents, and quite frankly, to avoid obligation to resettle people who left China after the 1949 revolution. Between 1949 and 1952, some 700,000 people left China for Hong Kong, then a British colony. By 1961, there were an estimated 1 million refugees living in Hong Kong, nearly one-third of the city's population. Government officials in the United States claimed it was impossible to tell who were bona fide political escapees and who were so-called rice refugees, people that left China not because they were persecuted, but in order to improve their lot in life. In fact, their condition reflected the experience of many people in the 19th and 20th century whose motivations to migrate included both economic and political factors. The drafters of the 1951 Convention worried that if countries were asked to assist refugees and displaced persons from Europe, it would be asking, from beyond Europe, it would be asking for too much. Indeed, the United States and the British settler nations, Canada, Australia, South Africa, had a long history of racism towards Asians and exclusion laws. In 1951, the convention explicitly excluded Asia and other non-European areas to make the convention more palatable to potential signatories. And here you see one of the most famous refugees from the Soviet Union, Stalin's daughter. As it turned out, can you see this? Okay. As it turned out, the United States did not sign the Geneva Convention, and in 1967, it finally did sign a convention of protocols which brought it under the terms of the 51 Convention. During this long tenure of national origin restrictions, presidents seeking to admit refugees fleeing from communism did so on an ad hoc basis, allowing entry under a provisional status called parole, and in some cases mortgaging their entries against future quotas. American policy was driven entirely by Cold War interests. This was abundantly clear in the 1970s and 80s in its welcome of Cuban refugees who did not have to prove individual persecution, the only people who did not have to prove it, while denying entry to Haitian refugees who were fleeing a right-wing dictatorship that was friendly to the United States. It was not until 1980 that Congress passed a General Refugee Act, which redefined refugees according to general human rights norms defined by international conventions. It established an allowance, a general allowance of 50,000 refugee admissions per year, and gave the president authority to increase it according to need. Okay, today the UN High Commission on Refugees counts 71.44 million persons of concern, nearly 20 million refugees, 3 million asylum seekers, 39 million internally displaced people, and 2.7 million stateless people. Only 1% of all world refugees are resettled in third countries, 1%. Most remain in refugee camps in countries of the global south. There are over 3 million in Turkey, nearly 1 million in Lebanon, 1.3 million in Pakistan. Kenya has hosted 3 generations of Somali refugees in the same camps for 20 years. And note, these figures do not include 5 million Palestinian refugees, generations of displaced Palestinians from the original 800,000 displaced by the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and that's just because they are managed under a different program. Now, the United States has settled more refugees than any other country, owing to the large numbers of Indo-Chinese and Cubans who came during the Cold War. But in recent years, the U.S. share of world resettlement has declined, just as the number of refugees in the world has dramatically increased. The United States now admits, on a per capita basis, fewer refugees than most industrialized countries in the world. We are number 28 out of 43. And that's as of 1914, so I think it's even worse now. In this chart, you can see the red color refers to Indo-Chinese refugees. Green refers to Soviet Jews who came in the 1990s. Blue marks people from Africa in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And the beige bars towards the far right of the spectrum are refugees from the recent Syrian civil war. And here we can see asylum grants. These data only go to 2016. So I'll get to what we're doing now on asylum. But in the last 5 years, 22% of all asylum cases have been rejected. And there's a huge backlog, as we know. So how does one become selected for refugee resettlement? How does one get to be one of that 1% worldwide to be resettled? Well, the UNHCR makes the first selection, often in consultation with receiving countries. Often those who have a family member abroad or who are particularly vulnerable are selected. A refugee cannot pick a country to go to. Once the United States accepts a case for review, there is a process of extreme vetting, which can take 2 years or more. It involves 8 federal agencies, 6 databases, 4 biometric checks, 3 in-person interviews, and 2 interagency reviews, all conducted abroad before the person even steps foot into the United States. Presently, there are 929,000 refugees and asylum seekers in the United States. More than half are asylum seekers, and they amount to 0.2% of the total population. And we carry a huge backlog of 500,000 cases. Once in the United States, a refugee has a special status as refugee. That's a legal status category for 1 year. Refugee resettlement costs are paid by the federal government. In 2015, it amounted to $582 million for 70,000 refugees, which figures about $8,400 per person. Refugee families get $1,000 in cash when they arrive, and what I consider to be very mingy benefits for 8 months. $800 a month for a family of 6 with no other income, plus social services like job training and English classes. Plus, they have to pay back the airfare, the cost of the airfare that brought them to the United States. Can you believe it? If a person's petition for asylum is approved, they automatically assume the legal status of a refugee. All refugees are required after 1 year to apply for a green card, that is, for permanent residence. This is a relatively short period in which we expect refugees to become settled and financially independent. Once they have a green card, they are eligible to apply for citizenship in 5 years. But they are no longer eligible for welfare benefits, such as Medicaid or food stamps, for 5 years. So I think this 1 year business is to get people off of welfare. That's, I think, the easy way to understand it. So international conventions and American law that separate economic and political migrations produce other distinctions, for example, between voluntary and involuntary migrations, and the idea that some people come to contribute to the nation and other people are victims or otherwise in need. These distinctions connote hierarchies of preference and legitimacy. Hannah Arendt wrote movingly about the experience of Jewish refugees after the war, about being reduced to beggars, about being told to forget, about the loss of their former lives and their occupational and social status, so important to one's identity, and to realize that in this mad world, she said, it is much easier to be accepted as a great man than as a human being. In her book, Elusive Refuge, Laura Madakoro describes the varied responses of Chinese who went from the People's Republic of China to Hong Kong to the label refugee. For many in southern China, it was not necessarily the first time that they or their family members had migrated to Hong Kong seeking work or safety during troubled times or war. There had been nearly 100 years back and forth movement between Guangdong province and the British colony. And like many Jews, many Chinese felt there was a stigma attached to being labeled a refugee. On the other hand, there were people who declared themselves refugees so they could have access to humanitarian aid. Madakoro shows us that being a quote-unquote refugee is not an inherent condition. Rather, it's a legal status category that is applied to certain migrants by international agencies and nation-state bureaucratic processing. Although it offers possibilities for a new life in a new country for some people who cannot go home, it also poses extraordinary burdens on these migrants. For example, those claiming past torture must have documentary or bodily proof of such torture, and paradoxically, once they are accepted for resettlement, they are expected to erase their past. Compared to immigrants whom we expect to be self-sufficient, refugees are by definition needy people. Resettlement policy provides some aid, but emphasizes getting refugees to be self-sufficient immigrants as soon as possible. We want them to suppress their traumas, to forget about ever going home, to embrace their integration into American society, although usually they enter the workforce as low-skilled, low-wage workers. As one employer said, refugees are great, they're cheap and legal. Many are treated as a racialized underclass, stereotyped like African Americans as improvident welfare takers and criminals. In our present moment, the Trump administration has flouted international and domestic law by closing the border to asylum seekers from Central America, people who are fleeing violence and civil disorder, much of which can be traced to past and recent U.S. intervention in the region. It used tear gas against families trying to approach the border. It then negotiated a process with Mexico whereby asylum seekers had to wait on the Mexican side of the border to be admitted by the Border Patrol in small numbers on a daily basis, what they call metering. Last spring and summer, thousands of people camped out in Tijuana for up to 2 months. Once admitted, the asylum seekers were taken to a Border Patrol facility and put into cramped holding cells or cages with no beds or mattresses and kept at an extremely cold temperature. The Border Patrol took their clothing, their medicines, their toothbrushes, and continued to separate children from them. The migrants called detention La Hiera, the icebox. Detention in the icebox meets the international definition of torture. Then, in this summer in July, the administration announced they would no longer accept asylum seekers arriving via a so-called third country, which is aimed at Central Americans waiting at Tijuana, but applies to anyone coming into the country. This new rule violates U.S. law and treaty agreements that passing through a third country en route to the U.S. is not a basis to deny asylum. Under current law, only those who have firmly resettled in a transit country or those for whom return to their home country would not be in danger can be barred. But the Trump administration now has made exceptions to the bar so limited that it is practically insurmountable. What's more, the initial credible fear interview, which determines whether an asylum seeker can be admitted and permitted to apply for asylum, is now being conducted by Border Patrol officers, no longer asylum seekers, and they are denying most cases and immediately deporting people. In the first 4 months of this fiscal year, fewer than 32% of reasonable fear screenings have passed muster. This compares to over 80% in the recent past. And although a federal judge enjoined this new ban, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled just last month that the administration can implement it while the case moves through the courts. This little girl, Fernanda Jacqueline Davila, is from Honduras. She's 2 years old. She was separated from her grandmother in July of 2018 before the immigration and came before an immigration court in New York in October of last year. Imagine bringing a 2-year-old before a judge. Immigration judges say they are accustomed to teenage unaccompanied minors in their courts, but now they are regularly seeing children under the age of 6. As justification for taking children from their parents or grandparents at the border and for other measures meant to deter or bar entry, the administration claims, as former Attorney General Jeff Sessions put it so well, that asylum seekers are exploiting loopholes in the law. In effect, he turned that which is legal into a suspect category, a kind of cheating. By describing asylum as a loophole for the unauthorized entry of undesirables, he underscored the non-normative nature of refugees and asylees. We think about immigrants as voluntary actors with whom we make a kind of deal. We will let you in and you will work hard and become an American. Asylum seekers are construed as people asking for a favor. So let's be very clear, this administration wants neither immigrants nor refugees. And as the administration makes it more and more difficult to successfully make an asylum claim, we have to ask how many people will simply become part of the undocumented population rather than risk denial and deportation. So what they're trying to do is, well, first stop people from coming in, but then those people who come in will be treated as so-called illegal aliens, not as people that have a legal right to apply for asylum. So I want to end just with some thoughts about how these issues raise questions of responsibility for us as a society. Do we have a moral obligation to foreigners, to the international community? What is the place of human compassion in public policy? What happens when the moral seeks policy, that is, when the moral becomes political? Refugee admissions and resettlement are distinct from regular immigration because we bear a heightened moral responsibility to people in extraordinary circumstances, even as what counts as extraordinary can be a moving target. The entire international community bears a collective responsibility, and to the extent possible, individual states bear responsibility to assist people whose home states have failed them. We think of moral responsibility usually in religious terms, but I also mean the ethics that attach to liberal democratic principles, that all humans are of equal moral worth and possess basic human rights. So I think this is a challenge we face. How can we help people start a new life in a new home without pressuring them to conform or assimilate, recognizing their agency and respecting their own strategies for survival, healing, and adjustment? I'd venture to say that refugees are more likely to achieve some semblance of well-being when they belong to strong ethnic communities, where they can find support from settled residents, religious institutions, and a familiar culture. Many refugees become small business owners in their communities, opening grocery stores and little restaurants or newspapers, a phenomenon we can trace to the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century in Chinatowns, Germantowns, and the Jewish Lower East Side. These dynamics do not hinder social integration. In fact, they might help promote it by providing economic opportunities and ameliorating social isolation and alienation. Despite our self-congratulatory rhetoric, American values emphasize that which is individualistic, competitive, capitalistic, and acquisitive. Compassion for the pain and suffering of others has but a faint imprint on our public policy. The most important exception historically perhaps was abolitionism, but we should remember that 19th century abolitionism was for a long time a fringe movement of religious activists, and ultimately support for slave emancipation prevailed because the moral argument was supplemented by a political calculus about national unity and development. Similarly, the people who opposed Asiatic exclusion were mostly Christian missionaries and white businessmen with trade interests in China. And when Congress repealed the exclusion laws in the 1940s, it did so for foreign policy reasons. In the mid-20th century, when Americans supported refugees fleeing communism, humanitarianism coincided with strategic self-interest. But in the late 20th and early 21st century, American attitudes towards refugees became more complicated by two trends. First, the shift in the figure of the refugee from Cold War freedom fighters to victims of violence, torture, or trafficking. that is precarious subjects, and therefore possibly with endless need and dubious potential to become good Americans, or worse, as actual terrorists. And second, by the rise of privatization, the increased emphasis on individual security and prosperity, and the decline of the social. The ethics that normatively attach to liberal principles diminish in proportion to the rise of me first and America first. So at a time when our political culture seems devoid of basic human kindness, maybe it's overly harsh to point to the limits of humanitarian concern. Yet humanitarianism is a complex phenomenon. While motivated by compassion and care for the suffering, and I want to emphasize those are good things, humanitarianism must be understood as a social relation. It is asymmetrical in its distribution of power and agency, and is commonly fraught with paternalism and the urge for social control. The refugee is constructed as a passive victim whom we seek to transform into proper liberal subjects and from whom we expect gratitude. And when the argument that refugees can help our economy might make people more welcoming, it seems overly harsh to criticize self-interest. So my point is not to reject humanitarianism or self-interest, but to ask us to think about both the power and limits of each approach, about what happens when the moral meets the political, how religion and politics are increasingly blurred, and what it means that we no longer think that a democracy requires moral policies or practices. I'd like us to think about, as the anthropologist Didier Fasson asks, what is gained and what is lost when we use the terms of suffering to speak of inequality, when we invoke trauma rather than recognizing violence, when we mobilize compassion rather than justice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, very thoughtful and insightful, actually. And I mean, this is a problem and a challenge not only to the United States, but actually the immense majorities of refugees are in the so-called global south. But also one that will become more and more acute because of other issues like global climate change globally, right? So questions, comments?
Hi, thank you so much for that. I was wondering, with the distinction that you point to between the economic and the political refugee, that you were trying to being a product of the 20th century, how do you see that distinction coming into the 21st century, and how does that distinction play out now?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. Did people hear her question? So right now we still have the same structure where we have a special category of refugee law, right, which distinguishes so-called political migrants, people who suffered persecution. What we see happening now in the United States and increasingly in the West is in some ways a collapse of that system, because the denial of political status to people is shoving people into the category of not economic migrants, but undocumented economic migrants, right? So what you can see this administration doing is transforming the refugee into an illegal alien. I put that in scare quotes, right? So a person now no longer has a right to enter and ask for asylum. They are apprehended, and they're given a quickie interview, and they determine that they don't have a right to be here, right? That's what they're doing now, and then they're deporting them. So if there are people who don't want to take their chances with that system, right? It used to be that, I mean, the whole thing of detaining people is really cynical, because the idea was that, Trump has this, he uses that phrase catch and release, right? You heard that phrase, catch and release. So catch and release was using a term from sport fishing, right? You catch a fish and it's the wrong size and you have to put it back in the water, right? So he's very cynically using this term, catch and release, to say that they would apprehend somebody, then they would ask for asylum, and then they would release them into the population and give them an appointment at a later date to come for their asylum interview. Now the thing is that over I think 90% of the people with asylum interviews show up for the hearing. It's not that they don't just abscond into the general population, never to be seen again. They want to get asylum. And the asylum rate was actually 80%, right, 78%. So 90% of the people who apply for asylum show up for the hearing, and of those, right, nearly 80% pass and get asylum. So to say that, we're no longer going to release people, they did it for very cynical reasons. They did it to deter other people from coming in, right? So there would be no incentive to come because you'd be locked up in an icebox for weeks and then put in a detention facility indefinitely or until your appointment, which could be several years, right? Because given the current backlog, it takes several years to actually get your hearing. So what they've done is they've created a situation where they treat asylum seekers as though they were illegal aliens. That's what I think is going on. And the fact that all these judges tell them they can't do it and they keep doing it is something that we have to really think about in terms of the kind of authoritarianism that's overtaken this presidency. Because, in the case of this third country ban, a federal court enjoined it, and then the Supreme Court said, no, you can go ahead and do it until, it gets resolved, until we get the case and we'll tell you it's fine. Right, that's, I think, what's going on in the courts. Okay.
I had a question. That the Refugee Convention defines a refugee as, well, one, a member of a particular group that is being persecuted by religion, race, political ideology, whatever, right? But the other one is that it's being persecuted by a state actor. And what we see more and more is that people are not being persecuted for being a member of a particular group, but just for existing, Hondurans and Central Americans. It's not that they're being persecuted for being evangelicals or everyone is dying. And the inflictors of violence are non-state actors. So that has complicated.
The perpetrators of violence.
The perpetrators of violence, right? So it seems that the 48 Convention was referring to a very different world than today.
Right, although
it
there
has
is,
become antiquated
but there
in
is a part of the law that says that when a state fails to protect people from violence that's perpetrated by non-state actors, that they can be considered asylees. So if the state's either the state is a perpetrator of violence or persecution, or if the state fails to protect people from violence.
And the other part, if they're not a member of any particular group.
Well, no, there has
population.
to be, no, they're supposed, so this is interesting in the, there are some people here who have worked on these cases more than me, but with the unaccompanied minors, some judges, they have to thread a very small eye in the needle to get asylum, because some of them have made the argument that they're targeted because they're young people. And some of the courts have said youth is not a protected class. It's not ascriptive. You grow out of it, right? Well, if you live, you might grow out of it, right? So some of them read the law very, very closely to say that being a young person targeted for recruitment by gangs is not a protected class. Whereas I think other judges have been a little more liberal. So this varies what kind of court where the court is that you come before for your asylum hearing.
This also raised what would happen to people who are fleeing ecological catastrophe. They won't fall under any of these categories.
That's right.
Well,
That's right. Right.
Hi. Do you know what's happening with the people that were returned to Mexico and are waiting for their court hearings with this new third country? If they are Central Americans, are they still able to apply for asylum?
If they actually came in and applied, and they would be detained, right? If their number got called, right, then they came in, and then they asked for asylum. Then, if they're determined to, well, they can reject them right away and deport them, or they go to the detention center, right? I don't know, do you know, Nara, what's happening in the camps right now in Tijuana? I mean, right now, that whole process has been upended by this new rule that they're not accepting people who are coming through, in transit through Mexico. You don't know, right? It's a good question, right? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask about if you could tell us more about in relation to the myth part, about the 67 protocol, considering that the original 51 convention did not even specify that anybody was eligible for asylum unless they were victims of events prior to 51, that happened in Europe. And only the protocol extended the definition. I was curious about the figure of the refugee. I assume it was purely the Cold War refugee. In American myth, around the time when the protocol appears, and why is the protocol actually something that becomes accepted? Because if anything, it would seem anomalous that the protocol is something that the US decides to sign.
Right, I haven't done deep research into why they signed the protocols in '67, but I think during the 1950s, they didn't sign the original because they wanted to pick and choose who they were going to let in, right? And they wanted only to have people fleeing communist countries, right? And so the main example we have in the 50s are the Hungarian refugees. We're not that many. They were not that many. They were construed as freedom fighters, and they also were European, right? And I think by '67, you have more Cubans who are coming. But the Cubans have a special law just for them, right? We have a doctoral student writing about the Cuban refugees, right? They have a special law which says that they touch US soil to get in, right? They don't have to prove any individual persecution, right? So that's a special exception. So I think it's an interesting question why they finally agreed to those protocols in 1967. It's not till 1980 that we have a refugee law, a general law, and that is the result of over a decade of kind of human rights activism in the United States that finally puts pressure. And a lot of it was also Jimmy Carter's commitment to human rights that you finally see an act in 1980. But that's a good question for more research, 1967.
Was that the wet foot, dry foot thing, the Cubans touching?
Yeah, but that's earlier.
Well,
that's Cuban
more
Adjustment
recent, right?
Act is 1966, 1960.
Yeah,
When's the Cuban Adjustment Act? It's earlier. It's early 60s, I think.
So the situation with the refugees and migrants all seem completely overwhelming. What do you think would be one of the first things, if we didn't have Trump and his whole administration, what do you think would be one of the first things we could do to alleviate the situation?
I think one of the things that should be relatively easy to do is to hire more asylum officers, right? We have a huge backlog of hundreds of thousands of cases. You know, Trump talked about sending troops to the border. He didn't say we should send asylum officers to the border. You know, asylum officers have incredible workload. Asylum officers have a big workload, but the immigration judges is the other category that has a tremendous workload. They have to decide a case like in a few minutes. That's their work orders. So you know, they could hire more people to adjudicate these cases. That would be relatively easy to do. You know, hire them and train them. Rather than hiring more Border Patrol officers, we should hire more asylum officers, right? I think that would be one thing we can do. And the other thing I think is, you know, I mean, even though the international conventions are very restrictive, you know, I mean, we could have domestic policy, domestic laws that recalibrate how we define refugees. And the other part is we have to think about how, I mean, this whole thing of having a separate legal system for refugees is based on the idea that our regular immigration system is restrictive. So you need another path to come in because the main door is closed. So you need to have a side door. But we should fix the main door too, right? And make it easier for people who want to come to this country to come to this country.
But I mean, talking about domestic policy is also domestic politics.
Right.
I mean, if you do surveys all over the world, show that the population is actually against freer immigration, and actually, if anything, they want more restricted immigration, even in countries where there are very few immigrants. That's actually, including Bolivia or something like that. I don't know. It's actually possible.
The polling in the United States, most people think that our immigration, they don't think we should have fewer immigrants. They don't think we should have more immigrants either, but they say the number we have is about right.
Yeah.
Now I think that's also an uneducated response, right? But even if the uneducated response is, it's about right, it's you know, and depending on how the question gets asked, 50 to 90% of people in public polls consistently say we should legalize the undocumented.
Yeah, that's probably
right. So if, you know, I mean, one of the problems is that the public can't connect the dots, right? Mm-hmm. If you understand that we have undocumented because the regular system is so restricted, then but you think we should legalize people who are undocumented, then you might want to consider fixing the original problem, right? Yeah. But that's somehow too complicated for the average voter.
And I would have thought that, you know, that people will be more willing the citizens of a particular country will be more generous and more willing to accept refugees, people who are fleeing for their lives, rather than people who just want to come to make some money. You would think that the image of the refugee would work in a positive way, right? That people will be more generous and more open to admitting into their polity people who are fleeing. But it doesn't work like that, you said.
Well, we live in a me, me only. We live in a me culture now of privatization. We don't think the government is responsible for anything. We've given up on the idea of a social collective responsibility. So you would think, yes, you would think. But, you know, humanitarianism is construed as a kind of snowflake, you know, liberals, or as just the domain of religious organizations. And I think that's really sad, that we've come this far from having any idea that civil society should have some morals, right? But, you know, what do we have in Washington? We have a bunch of crooks running the country, so where's the morality, right?
Yeah, wow, that's...
not to put too fine a point on it.
So let me try and turn the conversation in a more optimistic direction, maybe, I don't know.
Thank you.
What do you, yeah, I'll try. So what do you think we can derive from this history that you've told us? What can history tell us about what activists should be doing today, as opposed to imagining another scenario? We have the scenario that we're in. What does history tell us? And in particular, is there something that we should understand about humanitarianism and its limits? I mean, it seems on the one hand that, you know, narratives of suffering children are the only thing that moves at least some people. On the other hand, you've pointed very eloquently to the limits of humanitarianism. But you also said that humanitarianism tends to work when it's connected to some political rationale. So is that what we should be doing, seeking out the political rationale that gives greater oomph to the humanitarianism? I mean, I don't know. What does history tell us we should be doing right now?
And I wonder if it is a rationale or a rationalization.
Right. Well, part of me wants to come back to you and say, who's we? We in this room, you know, concerned individuals, members of society, right, or any of the above, right?
Whichever one you want to.
I think right now we as individuals should do what we think we can, what we can. I mean, there are many ways. Let me say this. I think sanctuary is a really powerful idea and a powerful movement. And it's, and what I mean by that is, I didn't talk about this today, but you know, we have, in the Constitution, the 10th Amendment says that the federal government cannot force states or local jurisdictions to enforce federal laws, right? So immigration is a federal enforcement question. And they cannot do all the things that Trump says they should do, ICE or the Border Patrol, without local cooperation. So I think on the ground, we can do a lot to push back against raids, against, you know, cooperating with ICE. You know, New York has a non-cooperation policy. I think the entire state of California, the entire state of Oregon, there are jurisdictions all over the country that have non-cooperation policies. And some of it is very limited, right? I mean, a lot of it is around what they call the detainer policy. So when local law enforcement picks up somebody, it could be for anything, you know, like a broken tail light or whatever, or a minor offense, they can only hold that person for so long if they don't charge them. And if, depending on the level of the offense, like if it's a DUI, it goes automatically into the big computer, the big database. And if ICE will pick up if that person has an outstanding warrant for deportation. And then the policy they want local jurisdictions to cooperate with is to hold that person until ICE can get there, even if it means going beyond the legal limit that you can hold somebody. And so, you know, like hundreds and hundreds of counties across the country refuse to do this, including like all the county sheriffs in New Mexico say, we're not going to do that. And a lot of it is not because they are necessarily compassionate, but because they think, local law enforcement thinks about how they can do their job effectively. And if they think that people are not going to report a crime, if people won't be witnesses, if people won't come forward, that it sours their own relationship with the communities. So even if we may be critical of what some of these sheriffs do or local police departments, they have their own interests in not cooperating with the federal authorities. And so if you think about how much the federal government depends on local cooperation to implement its agenda, pushing back against that, I think, can actually goes a long way. So they have, they have staged raids in places like Los Angeles. They have done it in New York, and you know, some of the activist groups like Make the Road, like they try to get there and protect people, although it's hard because it's a big city. So I think there's a lot of things we can do as individuals or as our student organizations to participate in kind of strengthening New York as a sanctuary in terms of non-cooperation policy, right, with ICE. And then there's all, you know, I mean, the stuff that you do, right? You take students to the border and help translate for people in detention. I mean, there's so many things that people can do, which at one level is like harm reduction. It's not necessarily making, you know, changing policy, but that's important, right? And I think probably your students don't think that they're doing humanitarian work, right? I bet they think they're doing social justice work, right? And I think that's kind of what I meant by kind of, you know, not to be down on humanitarianism, because we could use more of it, but to more try to push that language towards more language of social justice. I think that's what we can do in our own work.
Thanks a lot. It's a difficult subject, but well.
Right, it's a difficult subject.
Face it, yeah. I mean, just to something on the positive side, that it's interesting, all of these polls, if they ask people what's their opinion of immigration, I don't know, 60% are against it or something. If they just change the wording from immigration to immigrants, it goes down to, I don't know, 40% or whatever, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. If then they change it to, instead of immigrants in your community, whatever, it goes down. So actually, basically what you're doing is humanizing it. The most that it becomes connected to humanity, to humans, the more generous that people become. And the more it's an abstraction, it's easier
right.
to be nasty. And so that's a good indication, I guess. Okay, so thanks a lot, and thank you for...
Thank you.